We are so excited today to have Stacey Gagnon, who is a trauma advocate and part of Trauma Lens Care, Lost Sparrows, Ransom For Israel blog, and the Trauma for Breakfast podcast, speaking with us today. And we are going to be talking about a very important topic: foster care, adoption, trauma, and the church, what the church should know. So Stacey, thank you for being here with us today.
Well, I am so excited to be here and to meet with you as well. I feel like the church should be driving relationships with those who have experienced trauma, especially that early adversity. So yay, excited that you're having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, I'm a big fan of your work, and I will tell you, you have so much stuff to share. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your story and why you felt called to work with people with trauma?
It's funny. I wouldn't say like I initially thought, hey, I'm going to work with trauma when I grow up, or I'm going to have 7 kids when I grow up, or I'm going to do some of the things I do. So I always think God has such a sense of humor. But like you had said, I work a lot with people who have experienced early adversity. I have 7 children. My husband and I were foster parents for over 14 years in the state of Arizona. 3 of our children were adopted through the foster system, and then 2 were adopted internationally. Really, I feel like so much of what my career has become is because we made so many mistakes. So honestly, when we're teaching and we're talking with whether it be foster and adopt families or teachers or church workers or even our inmate population and different people, we talk a lot about how we learned in the first years of fostering and adoption, all the things not to do. And so let me teach you those so that you don't make those mistakes. And I can actually say, looking back, having been a children's director in a church for 7 years, let me today teach you the things that I wish I had known then, because I disciplined trauma in kids a lot. And so I wish I knew the things then that I do know now.
Yeah, that is a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about. Is in the church, we often talk about fostering and adopting children, but then we're not always ready in the church to serve those kids, because sometimes that trauma does cause challenging behavior. What do you think that the church should know?
Well, I think right off the bat is to understand that every child, whether they were adopted right from the womb, you were in the hospital, they handed you a baby and bio mom felt good about it and all that stuff, like there is loss and a breaking of the motherhood bond when a child is taken from a biological mother, or even when bio mom's okay with it. But on top of that, when you are dealing with children in your church who are in foster care or who have been in foster care, recognize that every single one of those children has experienced trauma. They all come to your church and they need to be looked upon as kids that have extra needs or special needs, because the way that their brain has developed and what they've experienced is going to inform behaviors.
One of the things I noticed on one of your websites was this model of a shark and a goldfish. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I love the shark goldfish model, because you see the shark fin above the surface. And when we're dealing with kids or we're dealing with adults who have scary behaviors, we see that fin, right? We see that shark fin. And internally, we have a response to bad behavior when we see it in others. And so what we tend to do as adults is we're triggered by this fear and we move to control. And so in those moments when we see bad behaviors or poor choices, we're going to want to move to control a behavior, when what we have to recognize is that scared kids do scary things. And instead of trying to punish or control the behavior, we need to go under the surface and figure out what's driving that fear. I was a teacher starting out, so I spent I spent the first part of my career as an public school teacher, and then I got my RN in pediatric mental health. And so when I was a teacher, oh my gosh, I was so good at setting up all the rewards and the consequences and the clip charts and all this stuff and managing the behaviors. But what I started to recognize is that I can be on behavior patrol all day long. I can do all the rewards and consequences, but if I don't actually drill down to what's driving the behavior, I'm not actually fixing anything. I'm just managing the shark fin. I'm just managing the shark fin and not actually getting to the bottom of what is driving this behavior, what is the relief found in the behavior for the kid, or what is the lagging skill or unmet need in this child. Because when I can answer those questions, then I can actually help a child to better regulate themselves and their stress.
So what would you tell some of our ministry leaders who are watching this if they see a child who is having challenging behavior, especially if they know maybe there's some trauma in their background? What should they do?
The first thing I would want to know is in a very careful way to try and get a little bit of history. I think when you're working with foster parents or you're working with adoptive parents, when you work together as a team to support the child, you are going to go very far. So if I'm able to make a phone call and just say, hey, I have Johnny, we are so excited to have him. I understand that he was just adopted, or I understand that he's in your home in foster care, and I know you can't give me all the history, but I want to be on your team. What are some things you can share with me? That's number one, going to set you up to be on the team of the parent, but also then to recognize that what children need coming into children's ministry is sometimes what we don't do within a church. Okay, so the brain that has had early adversity, it's always trying to predict what's going to happen. And so it's always living in like a little bit of a hypervigilant fear space. And what this looks like in boys is the outward behaviors that look like ADHD. What this looks like in girls tends to be that shut down behavior. So we know that 70% of boys are that outward trauma behaviors, like can't sit still, outbursts, can't keep hands to themselves. And then girls tend to internalize, and they're the ones that are just shut down, daydream, blunt affect. Okay. And so when you are seeing this in your kids, we bring them into children's ministry and we don't provide predictability a lot of times. And we also don't tend to provide an environment that's going to support a brain that's feels scared, right? And that's because we tend to have rotating volunteers. Mm-hmm. We tend to have rooms that we're amping up excitement and craziness in the beginning because we want kids to come, and there's not a lot of structure. And so, and I know it's hard because, again, I did children's ministry 7 years, but if there is any way to be able to have some consistency in the day, whether it be the same, the first 5 minutes is always the same. Right. That's going to help calm that brain. Or we're going to make sure this child who really has a very, you can see those behaviors, is going to have that teacher who's consistent and predictable. And we like to say it looks like Groundhog Day.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, you said a lot of really important things, and I want to stop and kind of go back and highlight. So the first thing I heard you say was when you are trying to get history from the family, you approach it in a way that you are aware that they may want to keep some things private. Mm-hmm. How important is that people feel like you care, but you're not prying more than they're ready for?
I think just having been a foster parent a long time, there is this sense of like, oh my gosh, I need to protect this child's story. I need to, and sometimes we don't know. Uh-huh. I need to make sure, that it doesn't just become this public information that's prayed about throughout the whole church. Right. Okay. And so I think when it's a children's director or someone calling and just saying, I want this child to have the most successful year with me, what can you share? I think when you do it that way It's different than saying, hey, is this one of them drug babies, right? Like I would walk into church and people would ask me questions in front of the children or a child, like, oh, did their mommy do drugs? Or are you going to adopt this kid? And you're like, oh my gosh, number one, this 4-year-old standing here, here's what you're saying. But number two, that's not something that we should be publicly sharing. Right. And I know it's not typically out of a space of like, there's no malintent behind it, but the perception is, oh my gosh, like that's, you're kind of ill-informed and you don't do this in front of kids, right?
Yeah, right. Before we go on to the next thing I want to highlight, I want to stay here for just a second. So I know a lot of what you're sharing today about kids with trauma is very similar to kids that have disabilities and hidden disabilities. And one of those things I think from a parent's perspective of a child who has a hidden disability is sometimes it's hard to tell your church leaders or the classroom teachers what's going on. They're afraid to tell. And I've heard in some of these ministry forums I've been in, teachers don't understand this and they get almost annoyed. Like, why wouldn't they tell us that the child has a history of trauma or challenging behavior? As a parent, why is that sometimes hard to share?
I think that there's fear that the information will be used as a weapon to exclude a child, right? So I think that, and I have 4 children with special needs and IEPs and all of the things. And if you don't trust a school or a special education director or a children's director on a basic level of just relational, I know they care about my kid, I'm not going to trust you with the information that there's something you can weaponize against my child. And I know that sounds very extreme, but I will tell you that there have been instances in my family where the information has been taken and used in a way to exclude my child or to make it so that my kid is not a part of something. And so I have fantastic relationships with our children's director at my church right now. I have fantastic relationship with the special education director at my kids' schools. And it's not always been that way, right? And so I think it has to be built upon trust. And it can't just be you're jumping into a conversation to get all the details.
So what I'm hearing you say is there's really 3 big things that church leaders can actively do now to help improve things. And the first is if they have a child who is struggling, they are realizing, I need to look at the child underneath the behaviors, right?
Yep.
Start with empathy.
Right. And no kid, I think that if the hardest kid, if you knew their history or story, would probably destroy you. I mean, if you truly knew some of what they had probably experienced, would probably wreck you. Yes. And I think that if you can recognize that no one wakes up in the morning, especially a child, and says, I hope I go to school today or I go to church today and the adults there don't like me. Right. I hope that the kids think I'm mean. Like that's not how it works. And when you recognize that scary behaviors in kids are subconsciously driven, it's not a manipulation, then it kind of changes the lens of how we view behaviors. Because we are really good at saying behavior is communication. But then it's like, but not past the age of 5. Once we get past the age of 5, you need to use your words. Well, when you have early adversity, when you have hidden disability, when you sometimes have special needs, we struggle with communication. And so we have to recognize then the behavior's telling us something. So we have to learn the language of trauma. By learning the language of trauma, then I'm able to listen to a behavior and interpret it and meet that need and help that child understand why they're feeling what they're feeling. Because trauma is not about what happens to you, it's about what happens inside of you. So we have churches full of adults and children who have experienced traumatic things, and on the inside, they're not okay.
Right.
So,
yeah. Yeah. The second thing I heard you say that's so important is when you are approaching the families, it's really about the relationship and building trust. It's not about looking for answers. You're not calling a parent to get answers from them or to give them answers. You are calling to form a partnership and form some plans that you work on together.
We love to listen by talking, right? And I think you would be really surprised if you just called and had that opening phrase of like, how can I best support you? What do you need from us for you? Because that just right there, to be heard, isn't that at the core of all humans, is to want to feel like they're heard and seen? But yes. I believe that is especially true in parenting children that have special needs or extra needs or brain differences. It's so stinking isolating. It's so isolating at times. So just to be heard, you will open up so many doors.
I agree. And then the third thing you had said, I want to point out, is you had talked about there are things we can do in the structure of our classroom or in kind of the predictability and the training of our ministry partners that makes a difference. And one of those things is when you do these things that help kids who've been through trauma or have disabilities, it actually helps every child in there. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, because I actually don't love trauma informed as a terminology, because I think everyone's like, I'm trauma informed, our church is trauma informed, my school is trauma informed, but then there's no application to it. So I believe what we have to be is trauma competent and understanding that behavior, it's when we can look at it as communication and we support it the correct way, then we're actually being competent in how we're handling kids. And the reality is trauma competent, whether it's in church or in a school is going to be what all children need.
Right.
It's going to be what all children need. And the church in some ways is a little behind. But I think there's also the struggle in it though too, because I think part of it is, oh gosh, that it's hard. We have bought into a lot of the American dream, and that suffering is it's not something that we're supposed to have. We're supposed to pray it away, right? And the reality is, if you look at all the disciples or you look at scripture at all, anyone who followed Jesus suffered. We will. And so, but we tend in the church to move away from that or be fearful of that. And you have no idea how many parents have been brokenhearted to be rejected by a Sunday school, or called and told to come get your kid out of class, or be told your child is not welcome because of their behaviors. And wow, your pregnant teen can't come to youth group, but they can serve in the nursery now. Like, there are so many things where I'm like, oh, what are we doing? We are called to walk alongside of messy brokenness, and setting up the environment to support kids that have had trauma is actually going to support all kids.
Right. Another thing that you just kind of mentioned is sometimes there is shame that comes with trauma. It's shame maybe that people have misplaced internally because they've been through hard things, or sometimes it's things that people, maybe even in the church, do that make people feel ashamed, like saying you can't come to youth group. As a church, how can we meet these people in a way that helps them, that is better?
So this is a really interesting concept. And I would say it's probably one of the most important things I'll say today. Okay. When we look at early adversity in kids, and we look at trauma happening early on, what is really key to understanding about shame is that kids who have been abused or who have trauma or who have neglect occur early, it actually becomes their sense of self. So I am bad. My parents aren't bad. I'm bad. I'm abandoned and rejected because I did something. Kids blame themselves. And so when adversity happens at the formulation of sense of self, then that's going to actually project across the lifespan. So we are going to live a life where, of course, I suck. I'm not lovable. I'm not worthy. And so when we as a church or as believers, we point out sin or we heap it on, of course, yes, I'm a bad person. Of course I'm in trouble in your classroom. Of course, because I'm so unlovable. My own mom didn't want me. I'm so unlovable. My parents went to jail. I'm so unworthy and unlovable that I live with my grandma or a foster parent or something. So when we recognize that sense of self is that these kids don't blame adults. They literally, it's the core of who they are.
Yeah.
To live in that shame and that unworthiness and unlovableness.
That is powerful. I mean, to think of it that way, I think when you really approach it that way, it changes everything. Certainly it changes when you see challenging behavior, if you're looking at it through that lens. How can we meet those kids there, and what can we do kind of help those families in that heartbreak?
So I'm going to tell you a story that's not very, this is one of those mistakes. Uh-huh. I always believed that kids were born resilient. And I always believed that, oh my gosh, thank goodness they came to my house at a young age, because love can fix this, and I'm going to fix this, right? Yeah. And I'm going to treat them like my bio kids, and it's all going to be good. And one of my very first placements was a 4-year-old. And I didn't get a lot of history on him. And so he came in my home, and he's dropped off late at night. And this kid was like this whirling dervish of just energy and destruction. I mean, breaking toys, pulling books off shelves, climbing my stair railing on the outside of the banister, like just ongoing. In the middle of the night, he was raiding food out of the pantry. He was I literally spent weeks just trying to keep the child alive because he was so out of control. And I'm like, holy cow. And still didn't know a lot of history, because at the time I was just told, he's a kiddo in care and you're his home right now. And so I had made cupcakes for all of my kids, and I told all of them, hey, don't eat the cupcakes. We're going to have them after dinner. Everyone will get a cupcake. And I left them on the counter and I went to fold laundry. And when I came back in, he was sitting on top of the counter, and he's got double-fisted cupcakes, and there's chocolate on his face, and he's already went through like 3 of them. So there's wrappers. And automatically I'm like, that's defiance, right? And my whole upbringing, and even in the church parenting classes, was like, defiance. You nip that in the bud, right? You don't let a child be, but like he outright did this. And so I go up and I'm looking at him, and I'm like, why you ate the cupcake? Well, okay, I know now. And I laugh, because then I ask people, and they're like, what did he say? And everyone will be like, yeah, he told you, no, he didn't eat the cupcake. And he's holding it. So he's like, no, I didn't eat the cupcake. And I'm looking at him, and he's lying. And I'm like, you're holding the cupcakes. And here I am, like, in my traumatized small brain, in his brain, two little brains are going to start arguing. And I look at him, and he whips the cupcakes behind his back, and he's like, I didn't eat the cupcakes. I didn't eat the cupcakes. And he's lying. And I looked at him, and I said, what is wrong with you? And that to me was the moment in time where it's like all the pieces came together for me. Because it wasn't something wrong with him, because he already believed that. He already believed something was wrong with him. And had he been able to answer, because behavior is communication, I later found out he would have said to me, what's wrong with me? My dad abused my baby sister and I sexually and brought men into the home. My dad physically abused us and neglected us. And my dad ended up murdering my baby brother in front of me. And it being this whole story of horror that I didn't know. But for him, in that moment, when I said, what's wrong with you? I saw the look in his face that said, I am bad to the core. Everything is wrong with me. Now, he stayed with us a year. That never was repeated again. He did amazing. He was loved on and did great, and went back home to family. But that moment, I recognized, when we have kids that have adversity or adults who are struggling with substance use, or people in our church who are struggling in their sin and are out of control, it doesn't help to point out what they already know,
Right.
but at their core already feel.
Yes.
And so when we can get to the core of the shame and recognize, like, something bad happened to you, that's not who you are. God created you to be lovable and worthy, and you are.
That is so powerful. And when I was researching for this interview, I listened to some podcasts you were on before. And in one, you were talking about how you used to be a fixer. And before I think you met your son Israel, you had the idea that you could fix things. And God really worked on you in that, with understanding that it's not always our call to fix people or fix things. Can you tell a little bit about your experience with that? And when we do, I want people to really listen and see how this relates back to us as the church when we're meeting these kids who have these brokenness and these needs.
Well, I think when I look at myself, I know the fixer part of me is all about control and outcomes, because I was a college athlete. And so I'm very performance driven in a lot of ways. And even in children's ministry, it was always about, like, oh, how many numbers did we get in? And how many kids at VBS, were saved, and all those things. And you're looking at those things. And the reality is like, my kids have taught me that parenting and teaching is about the long game. And a fixer is about the short term. And a fixer, you can't fix a brain that's been altered by adversity. It's what it is, right? It is what it is. And it's a brain that thinks differently. And the reality is that when we parent for the long game, which is eternity, we parent across a lifespan here. And my best example of this is I was working with our inmate population, and I had 15 men sitting in a circle, and one of them got teary-eyed, and he was in his mid-50s. And I remember thinking, like, don't cry in jail. It's not good. You're going to get beat up later. Right? No. So he's sitting there and he gets teary-eyed, and it's really silent, and everyone's looking at him, and he goes, thanks for being a foster mom, Stacey. I have a foster mom. And I'm thinking, like, you're 55 and you've been in prison for a long time. How do you have a foster mom? But he starts to tell me about his foster mom named Betty, who calls him every week still. And all of his whole life, since he left her home at the age of like 16, out of care, right into juvie. And I thought, oh my gosh, this woman is long game. This woman is, I am calling you every week and telling you I see your worth and your value, and I love you in spite of the sin and the choices and the hard things, because at your core, I believe in that you are a creature created by God who's worthy of his love. And I thought, that's what we're supposed to be, is that long game. We're supposed to be in it for the long game with these kids. And so that, when I think about children's ministry and I think about parenting and I think about myself as a fixer, I have to remember that we're in this for the eternal long game, not the short game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think when we have kids in our churches, that we can't fix their problems. We can't make it all better, but we can work on relationship. And that's why I hear what you're saying from this story is he had relationship, a healthy relationship with his foster mom. And how difference making is that?
Absolutely. And the fact, it was funny because then a bunch of the other guys in the circle all started crying and talking about different relationships in their life. And we talk a lot about, you guys in children's ministry and in teen ministry, you're going to have the opportunity to have influence or control. Mm-hmm. And when you influence through love, instead of trying to influence through fear, because influencing through fear leads to control. Great. I can manage behaviors all day long. But if I can influence through love, that's life-changing.
Can you give an example of how someone can influence through love?
When there is scary behaviors or hard behaviors, it's being willing to sit in those moments and hold the space with someone. And so we had a family that was fostering a teen mom that had already like she was from inner city Chicago. She was pregnant. She was known as a runner. So she had run from like 20 something foster homes. And this couple had talked to me about like, what do we do? And I said, when she runs and they bring her back, just sit and hold the space. So we call it holding the space. And that's literally just sitting in the moment, just saying, we're here to see you and listen. And we're not like, it wasn't about what is the punishment I need to make her stay here. It was about how am I going to influence through love? We want you here. We care about you and your baby, right? And they said that it was funny because it had been about 2 months of running. And every time the cops brought her back. And then finally she came in and she said, I'm staying now. I'm going to stay. And they're like, oh, okay. She goes, I'm not running anymore. And they're like, well, why'd you choose that? And she goes, you are the first family I've ever stayed with that doesn't tell me and talk to me and talk at me and tell me all the things I need to do and how I need to change. She goes, you're willing to accept me where I'm at. And I think you really care about me. And I think sometimes influence in relationship is truly about learning to keep your mouth closed and just sitting in the space and not looking for the best way to punish a behavior or looking for the best way to manage something, but literally sitting in the pain with someone, just saying, I can't imagine how hard this would be. Because do we really know? Really? For myself, I grew up my mom was amazing and loving. Do I truly understand what the kids that come through my home have lived? No. So how can I sit there and tell them you're not allowed to feel that way or you're not allowed to act that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so powerful because the truth is we don't have the power to fix things, but we do have the power to listen. And there's so many people who've been through trauma who've really never had people listen.
Yep. And here's the other thing that we say a lot too. You're not everybody's mentor. We say mentors, but you're not going to connect with every child.
Right.
But there's someone in your church that can. And so I would be looking at my kids in my church who are struggling the most, and I would be looking for mentor type relationships for them. Someone that's going to pour in, that's going to be like, hey, I'm glad you're here. Hey, you want to go kick a ball after school tomorrow? Like someone that's going to walk alongside them and be willing just to be a part of their life, even in the pain. Because you can't be the end all for every kid that comes through your church, but you can connect them to people that can walk that with them, because their relationships are the agents of change. Relationship is the power, where we find the power of change and helping heal trauma. Because when you think about at the core of trauma, relationship caused the pain. Relationship caused the pain. And so when we look at what's going to help heal it, relationship helps heal it, but there's going to be pushback, because how scary is it to trust relationship after you've been destroyed by it?
Right. That's right. And so in our work too with the church, one of the things we want to do is teach the gospel to kids. But one thing about learning the gospel is we kind of all interpret it based on our own life experiences. So if you're someone who grew up in a stable home with a loving father, it's really not hard to grasp the concept of God as a loving father. But if you're someone who comes from abuse and your father was like the father you were talking about, then that might be a harder concept. As ministry leaders, how can we meet kids right where they are and teach them the gospel and answer those hard questions? What's the best way to approach that?
That's such a loaded question, Barb.
It is, but it's so important. I really want people to hear this, because I think when we just give pat answers sometimes, or we expect everyone to see things the same way, we do a disservice to the people and to the gospel.
Yeah. I will tell you that for much of my early adulthood, I struggled with that concept. My father was alcoholic, abusive, scary. And so the whole idea of God as Father was really hard for me to wrap my head around. And I will say that I don't think that most kids that have trauma will have the ability to make that leap or to differentiate, right? I think that just starting with that, I think when you are looking in ministry at leading people to a relationship with Christ, it's going to be Christ through you. Mm-hmm. It's going to be Christ through you, because you can't, and I would say this is even working with inmate population or substance use or those kind of things. It has to be allowing the Spirit to work through you, and you are almost like able to shine that love to them, because it's not going to be the constructs are skewed. Sin has destroyed the construct that God designed of what that father figure looks like and what family looks like. And so because sin has destroyed that construct, we have to utilize what God has given us in relationship with these kids, and it's loving them in spite. So when I say I'm going to love them, Christ loves them through me, it means that even when they reject me, even when, and I'm being literal, they spit on me, even when they kick me, hurt me, all those things, I'm still loving you because you're worthy. Right. And then it's, okay, I'm able to do those things. It's because of Christ in me. And I think that's, and I don't know if that's a pat answer or not, but I do know that for me, it was being loved by godly people that helped me to change the construct that was broken when I was a child. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't understand that father that so many talk about as being good.
It really is more, I think, about the relationship and how we treat people than sometimes what we say. With that, I would ask this: if you have a child who comes and asks you like, why did God allow these things to happen to me? Because I think that is a hard question you might hear. Do you think it's okay just to sometimes say, I don't know, but I'm so sorry? How should a ministry leader handle a question like that?
I would say, I hope that you would say, I don't know, because I don't think God, I'm not God. Right. Like, I mean, my kids have asked those questions to me. My kids have asked, why was I born without an arm and a leg? Why am I in a wheelchair? Why am I not with my mom and dad? Why didn't they want me? I mean, but I think instead of, sometimes you hear that question, at the core of that is about what's wrong with me that I'm this. And that the idea is, remember, we go back to kids having that shame and that there must be something wrong with me, that God would make me this way. Mm-hmm. And so it's really drilling down to that. And so what my answer in this is that exactly what you said. I don't know, but we all have things that we struggle with. Mm-hmm. And some of them are visual, you can see them. Some of them are inside of us and we can't see them, but you are not alone in having struggles and pain and hurt. And it grieves God's heart. It's not something that God designed for our world, right? But at the same time, I think hearing that you're not alone, mm-hmm. and saying, I don't know. I mean, because I'm not going to be able to whip out some perfect answer, because there's not. And honestly, that was one of the hardest questions for me, is when Israel, my son, said, why am I in a wheelchair? Why won't God let me walk? Right. I had several women in the church come up, say to him, I'm going to pray that God will have you walk. Well, in his little mind then, if I pray hard enough, I'm going to stand and walk. And he couldn't understand why he wasn't walking, because he was praying to be able to walk. Right. And so it was just a series of conversations around that, and recognizing that God created you exactly how you were meant to be. Mm-hmm. And that we all have things that are hard or difficult, mm-hmm. right? But at someday we will all be perfect. Mm-hmm. But man, it's hard, Barb. I feel like there's not some easy answer with that.
I don't think there is an easy answer. And that's kind of what I want people to hear, because I think so often we want to give the right answer to hard questions. And when we do that, sometimes it's the wrong thing to do, because one of the things that a lot of people have talked to me about since I've been doing these interviews on different types of disability is that when you're really grief-stricken, whether it's because you have an illness or disability or trauma or whatever, but like that's that core of, this is so hard and the average person doesn't get it. Mm-hmm. people have often been met with like a Bible verse and almost dismissed.
Right.
I hear this over and over and over again. And I know, and I've had this happen in my own life before too. And I know what that feels like. And I know it's well-intentioned a lot of times. Or someone might meet you with a theology lesson. And I know that's well-intentioned, but what happens is it's not helpful. Right. And so I think what I've been told by other people is really, it's exactly what you said. It's really more about meeting them at the heart in a genuine connection that says, I see this is hard. I hear this is hard, and I'm here for you. I don't have all the answers. So
yeah, and I think I absolutely agree with you, because there are also, like, if you think even about scripture, like the lame man who got up to walk, and God says, you know, you were created for my glory to shine through you. But when you use that as an answer, think about that. Israel, you can't walk because God's gonna be glorified through you being in a wheelchair. How does that sound?
Right.
Not good. Okay.
Right.
And but if absolutely, God will be glorified through Israel. God will be glorified through. But at the same time, when you say things like, or God won't give you more than you can handle. Yeah, he does. Right. Like God, like there are things that happen that are so hard, and you actually hit the nail on the head. Grief, there is grief in that. Mm-hmm. There is grief for my son that he can't walk. Mm-hmm. There is grief for my other son who was born without an ear and craniofacial deformity, that he doesn't look like everyone. By coming at my kids and not allowing them to have grief and wrestle out these questions with their God in heaven, it's not meant to wrestle out with their mommy on earth. It's meant for me to say, I don't know. That's hard. Right?
Yes.
We have to allow people to grieve what their dreams were going to be, or what is not what's considered normal.
Right.
And I think it feels more comfortable in the church to throw out something theological maybe, or to have a pat answer, or to say, I'll pray you walk. I've never had someone say, I'll pray for your son to grow an ear. So I don't know what the difference is, right? Yeah. Like those kind of things where you're like, oh, it's hard navigating those with kids. But I think for us, it's just been allowing them to share their grief and not giving them platitudes, but saying, yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. How important is that with the parents and the siblings too? What can the church do to really support the whole family?
Oh, I think that there's grief on all levels, right? But it's, oh gosh, I'm going to unpack this, and I want this to be said in the most loving way. Mm-hmm. When you have a child with a disability or a difference or an illness, or you adopt, there's going to be grief around what your expectations were, but sometimes you're not allowed to grieve that. It's not okay to not be like, hey, I'm so happy and just accepting this. Instead, we're not supposed to say that there's grief in that my kids are struggling the way they are, or weren't born what we consider to be normal, or weren't like, and I would say there's seasons of time with the grief too. So like, for me, there's not being invited to the birthday parties, or the rejection by social peers, or the, oh my gosh, my kid isn't going to be able to sign up. He wants to play soccer. My son's, has no feeling from the upper waist down, and he thinks he's going to go kick a soccer ball. Like there's grief in seasons. And I think it's almost like you're not allowed in foster care and adoption because you chose this. Mm-hmm. And then maybe not allowed when your child has a disability because your kid is alive and you should be happy with the child that you have. Like, but it's hard. Like there's just, I feel like it ebbs and flows, and there's seasons of grief, and it's hard to share that without sounding like I'm not grateful and don't love my kid.
Yeah, we hear that a lot. I've heard that from a lot of parents who are dealing with really hard things, that they feel like they're not allowed to talk about the ugly parts. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things, I'm very passionate about church and about equipping the church to meet the needs of families and whatever special need it is. and this is one of the biggest things, is church has to be genuine. And it has to be a place where people can be ugly, where people can say ugly things. And so we just I've heard this over and over and over again. I feel like I can't be real.
Yep.
How important is that? That church is a place where people can be real. They're allowed to be real.
I think there is a reckoning coming with churches in a lot of ways. I think the church has developed into an entertainment model in a lot of ways, instead of being what the church was designed to do, which is to be reaching in. And we're all broken. We're all broken. Yeah. Like, we're all messy. Like, I just am able to clean myself up more and present myself, but I am just like the substance using addict across the street. I am just like, the person who's homeless and struggling under the bridge. We are all at our core broken and unworthy of the love that is given to us, but yet we don't tend to live that way at times. And so I think when we look at church and we look at, like, I call it unacceptable sacrifice. Like, I'm comfortable if you foster, but only like one kid, maybe. The minute you show up in my church building with a van full of 12 kids who are all, different disabilities and nationalities and behaviors and all the things, that just tipped you into like crazy lady, right? So there's all these acceptable things that are sacrifices, but then it tips into kind of that unacceptable, uncomfortable realm. We need to be uncomfortable. If you are not uncomfortable in how you serve and what you're doing, then you are not probably doing what God has called you to do. Because do you think any of the disciples felt comfortable and confident all the time? Ooh, right. And look across Scripture, like, we are called to be uncomfortable. And so I guess I would encourage people to look at uncomfortable instead of acceptable, because uncomfortable is messy.
I love it. I agree 100%. Uncomfortable is where we grow as people, as representatives of Christ, as the church. Well said.
Well, and then I would add one more thing, and this is for those going to church. We have turned into a culture where we go to church to be served. We have opinions on the music. We have opinions on the comfortableness of the pews and the message of the pastor and all of those things. But we are supposed to go to church to serve. You need to choose a church that doesn't have the ministry you want and say, hey, I'm starting this ministry because I feel like God's called me to it, and let me do this, right? That's what we're supposed to do, is we are supposed to be serving, not being served on Sunday until the next Sunday.
Right. That is so right. Stacey, can you tell us a little bit about your own faith and how it has impacted the journey that you and your husband and your family have been on?
Yes, I would love to. I told you in the beginning that my dad was an alcoholic, and my mom, we went to church on Christmas and Easter, and when we could go, but I was raised by a single mom who really struggled. And so I would say that my faith didn't really take root until college. And at that time, I was a very controlled person. I was a full ride college athlete, 3 sports, and very driven, and also scholar student as well. And so I was very driven, and I basically had a coach that came up to me and said, you're riding the fence, and you need to either need to be on God's side and accept him as the Lord of your life, or you need to get off the fence. And it was like that moment I realized, holy cow, I have been controlling my entire life. And so then began a series of decisions, from fostering to adoption to career, that really was a deconstruction of what I say is the American dream, and doing things that were so out of my comfort zone that I felt like I was going to be destroyed. And I've spent a lot of time on bathroom floors in foreign countries crying my eyes out like, oh my gosh, I might not survive this. But I see where God had to continually break me down and make me do things that felt really scary and uncomfortable because I'm such a fixer control freak. Mm-hmm. And it really culminated to our adoption of Israel. And that was when I was talking about the bathroom floor thing, where I was like, I'm like this foster parent. I've done the hardest kids in the system and all these things. And I feel like God's calling us to adopt this little boy in Eastern Europe and all this stuff. And I went to meet him and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to bring this child home and he's going to completely destroy me, because he was like a feral animal and scary and very medical, and his needs were way higher than anything I had ever seen. And I mean, like, I remember going back to my hotel room the first night and I'm literally on the bathroom floor in Bulgaria and crying and begging God to not make me do this, and that I couldn't, and that he needed to show me how I could do this. And so the next day when I went back to the orphanage, they told me he was sick, and they took me back to his section of the orphanage, which was the sign on the door said the section of the malformations. And I walk into his section and all of these children are just like in their own rooms and just rocking and beating their heads on the wall and chewing their fingers, and they're bleeding. And I'm like, it was so just overwhelming. And I sat with Israel, who was tied to his crib because they said he would get out, and he was so sick, and he just rocked and swayed for 2 hours. And afterwards, I'm like completely destroyed that this is this child's life. And they said, hey, we want to take you back to a room because we hear you're a nurse. And I knew, I'm like, oh God, don't make me do this. Like, I knew it was going to destroy me. And so they took me back to this section, and it was like a dying room full of all these babies dying. And I went into like nurse mode, and I started going to each baby, and I'm like, we need this and we need this. And the translator came up and he's like, stop. They just need you to bring the NG tubing to feed the babies and the suction tubing to clear their lungs, because they're using the same one on every baby. And it was like, that is an example of how God has had a continual destruction of my pride and my thinking I can do things on my own, me being able to white knuckle things and control stuff. Mm-hmm. So I went home, and that's where Lost Sparrows was born from, the whole nonprofit, and bringing home Israel. And he is the most amazing gift we could ever have received. And I think back to all of these moments in my life and in my faith where God has had to continually break me down and say, like, no, step out of my way. You need to step out of my way. Yeah. And so that's been a lot of my faith journey, is I get in the way and God moves me out of the way.
Yeah. I love that. That actually reminds me a lot of my own story, which is completely different than yours. But the one thing we have in common is I do get in the way and need to get out of the way. And when God grows you in uncomfortable ways, I like to call that the gaps. Like, here's what I can do, and then there's a big gap for that I can't do anything to get where we need to go. And I think that's where God does his best work, if we get out of the way of it.
Absolutely. And, you know, a lot of times we're called to step into the gap and free fall till God shows up. Because I think that a lot of mine is just that I'm afraid. And again, that goes back to what you asked earlier about that daddy figure, because my father let me fall.
Yeah.
My own father let me fall. And so to trust my heavenly Father, it has been a series of free falls where he shows up every time, and he shows up and he shows up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. It's beautiful, really, because your story really, it just shows no matter what you've been through, you do have someone who loves you, who's going to be there for you always. Yep. And also, it is scary. And the more things you have been through, the scarier that is.
Yep.
And so that's just a beautiful testimony. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Well, I absolutely have just been so incredibly blessed, and I continue to do the free falls. Like there's, like a new project that we're rolling out that's still scary as well. And I just am like, okay, it's all right. I know, I'm getting better about it.
Yeah. I'm a free faller too. Our stories are different, but I feel like that every time we try something new with Wonderful Works is like, it's scary to try new things and to trust, but you just got to trust that He will catch you. And whether you succeed or fail, if you're obedient, then you've succeeded, and that's enough.
Well, one of the things I want to pitch real quick is Las Sparrows. If you, we do a lot of trauma-informed trainings for churches.
Awesome.
So, and we just got done doing a training at Momentum Youth Conference with workers, the staff, on understanding the brain and really tying it to Scripture, because there is a pretty big disconnect. Because we, in some ways, we want to use Scripture to be able to punish or to pound it home. And so we were able to kind of unpack that some and really, really talk about the best way to support these kids, but also the adults within the church who have experienced that early adversity.
Yeah, so that is awesome. We will definitely be sharing that and all of your resources in our Wonderful Works Facebook group. Stacey, thank you so much for talking to us today. Is there anything, there's one thing you want people to leave with today, what would it be?
Wow. Again, I'm just going to reference back, like, I hope everyone has the mindset of to be like Betty, right? To be like that long game of, even when it seems hopeless, even when it seems like this kid is destined for prison, okay, then be that person that's going to show up and call every week, right? Because we have to look at the long game when we work with kids and families and people, because that's the eternal reward, is that long game. So I guess I would end with that, is let's all be like Betty.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Stacey. We're just really grateful for your time today, all that you do.
Thank you so much too, Barb.